for the Honorable Cap, episode 25. The Honorable Judges, Jason Merle and Joe Ruiz presiding. Good morning, Jason.
Good morning, Joe.
We have a special jury duty experience edition of the Culture and Arts Podcast this morning. And the reason we're doing this today is because Jason and I, ironically, of all the people in the county that we live in, both were selected for jury selection on the same day, in different courtrooms, in the same courthouse, and were both selected to sit on the jury panels. What are the chances of that happening?
I think we're being targeted.
You think so?
I think so.
Is it a Cap thing, or is it a Libertarian thing?
Maybe a little of both.
Yeah. I was really surprised to be chosen. I thought that my libertarian anarchist bent, my work in the media, my writing, my podcasting, one of those things, maybe being a former congressional candidate, I don't know, one of those things would disqualify me. And they did not. I definitely thought that being a Merle brother, you would be disqualified.
well, this is actually the second time I've had to do it.
Me too.
So, but, when I told my bosses that, I was going to have to miss because I had to go in for jury selection, I said, well, hopefully I won't have to do it. And they said, oh, come on, you're the All-American boy. You're going to be the first one they take. And sure enough, I was the first one they picked.
First one, huh?
Yeah.
Pick number one, draft one. Well, I'm excited, man, because, for those who listen to the Cap but aren't necessarily following WeAreLibertarians.com, if that's possible, We Are Libertarians is the sister podcast, the political podcast. And the two genres are so different that we don't always get crossover. But we do post all of our stuff at WeAreLibertarians.com and kind of leech off of their brand from time to time. And I wrote a 3-piece article and then merged it all into one piece about my jury duty experience. So you get to see my stuff in detail. I'll get into a little bit today if we have time. But since the Cap is usually only around 30 minutes long, I wanted to make sure that we got Jason's story because I haven't heard it yet. You haven't heard it yet. And I'm just excited to see what his case was about, how the people around him thought, et cetera, et cetera. So, Jason, tell us about your story.
Well, first, I do want to encourage anyone who hasn't read your article on We Are Libertarians to do so, because I've dabbled a little bit in writing, and I just thought the level of detail you got in that, I was really impressed with that. So
Thank
I
you.
want to encourage everybody to go read that. But let me start with my trial. When I went in for jury selection, they basically had about 45 or 50 people there, and they called us all into the courtroom, and I think the first 14 people they picked just a question. They had us go and sit over in the jury box. I was the third person amongst the ones they were questioning, and the questions were pretty basic. And just a little tip for anybody who wants to get out of jury duty selection. The key isn't to explain the inconvenience it's going to cause in your life to have to serve.
Right.
The key is to convince them that you cannot be impartial.
Right.
Okay, because we flat out had a lady say that her son had been to prison, and she was so hurt that when he was sent away that even if she felt the defendant was guilty, she would not be able to vote that way to cause that pain to somebody else. And so the prosecutor was like, so just so we're clear, you're saying that even if you believe we've proven our case beyond a reasonable doubt that he's guilty, you won't be able to vote guilty? And she said, yes. So, of course, she wasn't picked.
That's the weakest link.
That's how you have to get out of jury duty.
Yeah.
And
I wonder if sometimes if people know that, and so they just go in there prepared with it, or
Right.
if it's like a legitimate concern.
Right. So anyway, they kind of start asking, questions about, our thoughts towards police officers. Would we value their testimony more than somebody else's or less than somebody else's? And, they want to hear that you're going to be impartial. And, one lady had said that, she works in retail. They use police, to help catch shoplifters. She would probably side with the police. So, of course, she wasn't picked. It's that, if it's the impartiality that's really going to keep you on or get you.
No matter what side you choose.
Yeah, no matter what side. Because if you're going to be partial to one, the other one's not going to want you there.
Right.
And then they asked kind of our opinions about guns, and I don't have a passionate opinion about guns either way, so there was no reason to disqualify me on that. And so I'm assuming there's going to be a gun charge involved in some way.
Right.
And so then they started asking our beliefs about drugs, and a lot of our libertarian listeners might, say, hey, we need to reform our drug law, so I don't know that I want to send somebody away. Mm-hmm. Which, not that I would disagree with that, but I feel like I can at least separate what I think our laws should be and what our laws currently are.
Sure.
So.
And if you went on a rant about not putting people away for petty drug crimes, you're likely to be dismissed, and then you aren't going to have an effect on a potential person's case. Maybe she gets put away because you weren't there to have your opinion.
Right, and there are issues where, like if it was a death penalty case, I don't think I could go through with it.
Right.
That kind of thing. But, I feel like I can be impartial. So I of course, was the first person they decided to keep. And so basically the jury, we went in at 12:30, and basically the rest of the afternoon was just picking the jury. And since I was in the first group, we were kind of sitting off in a separate room, so we didn't even get to see the jury selection for everyone else. And somebody even made a comment as we were back there. Said, it's probably the nerds that want to do this that don't get picked. And ironically enough, a friend of mine and one of our listeners, Eric Seymour, posted on Facebook later that day, he had to go in for jury duty where he lives.
Yeah.
And he made a very similar statement. He's probably the only person that wanted to do it, and he didn't get picked.
I almost feel like if you want to do it, though, you shouldn't. Like, if you're too eager to have that much influence on someone's fate, then maybe you shouldn't be a part of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like politicians, like the ones who want to be president are probably the ones who shouldn't be president, because that just means that they want that position of power.
Right.
Or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of power. There's a lot of responsibility that goes into being a juror. I mean, you're determining whether someone spends time in jail or spends a fortune in fines and penalties or whatever. And if you're very eager to be that person, then, I mean, do you really want that guy in charge of what's going to happen to you?
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And so, anyway, and amongst the questions, they were asking, they were trying, the defense attorney was trying to figure, basically asked a question about if you felt the defendant was probably guilty, but it wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt, would you be able to vote not guilty? And that's an important question, because I always kind of struggle with how do you define reasonable doubt? Mm-hmm. Because they don't have to prove it beyond all doubt.
I will say it's a great Jay-Z album.
Okay.
Reasonable doubt.
I'll take your word on that.
But I digress.
Did you see the Saturday Night Live bit last night?
No.
They did a little bit about, it was like almost a biography movie about Jay-Z, but it was played by a white guy. And so they have white guys playing all these rappers. So, of course, the language they're using is almost, I don't even know the word for it, but instead of like cussing, it's almost, very very childish curse words that they would put in cartoons.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was kind of clever. But, anyway, so the way the defense attorney was trying to explain reasonable doubt, he went into this long, drawn-out story that almost put us to sleep about how when he was a freshman at Notre Dame, that was during the blizzard of 78, he said there was this big lake that froze.
Okay.
And so people would normally, when the lake was frozen, just walk across it instead of walking around it.
Okay.
And so he said the way he would define reasonable doubt is, would you walk across that lake like in March? Which really doesn't help.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
Yeah.
It's just kind of a... But the one thing when he asked the question about, would you vote guilty if he was probably guilty, as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt, that really stuck with me.
That's an easy way to put it.
Yeah. So anyway, we had to go in the next morning when the case started, and basically he's charged with 3 things. He's charged with carrying a gun without a license.
Okay.
Possession of marijuana. It was a very small amount. These are all misdemeanor charges.
Okay.
And resisting arrest.
All right.
Okay. And basically, the state called like 4 police officers as their witness, and the defense only called 1 witness, the defendant's wife. And it kind of and basically the way the story happened And we really weren't happy with this cop's story, from the very beginning. But he was driving up, and this is going to get very specific to the geography of downtown South Bend.
Okay.
But the cop was driving on Michigan.
Uh-huh.
And the defendant basically pulled in front of him in a white Crown Victoria, which is used to be a police car.
Old police car, yeah. I hate when people drive those things. They get them at auctions or something, and I always think it's a cop.
So the cop tried to run the plates to see whose it was, which is really what bothered us, because he really had no reason to do that.
Right.
Your curiosity doesn't justify that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and he wasn't able to get a return. So he basically followed the guy. So he was going up Michigan, turned onto Colfax, where the Morris is. Okay, and there's a little street right there. It looks like an alley, but it has a street designation. I think it's called Woodburn Court.
Okay.
The defendant turned down that alley, and the cop followed him, and he pulled into I think it's a TCU parking lot.
Okay. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
So he pulled in, waited for a parking spot to open up, pulled into the parking spot. Cop pulled up behind him and blocked him in and turned his lights on. Okay, and again, the cop even said in his report he hadn't seen anything that would have, no violations, no traffic violations, no anything.
But his plates weren't registered.
He couldn't. They were registered, but he couldn't get it to come up on his computer.
Oh, that's convenient.
Yeah. So now, and we all kind of said as we were discussing the case, had he stayed in his car, he probably would have been fine, because there was no reason for the cop to really even question him.
Right.
But the defendant gets out of his car, looks at the police officer, says, "Go, go, go," and takes off.
What?
Okay. So he starts running. Now, once he starts running, that kind of opens up.
There's probable cause.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and all of the charges were from the moment he ran. There wasn't anything, there was no traffic violations involved.
Okay.
So he ran back down that alley. Cop lost sight of him. And after after some time passed, he came back the same way. And another cop had blocked off the alley. So when he sees the second cop, that's when he, kind of surrenders. They see him throw his cell phone.
Okay.
And they arrest him. They found some marijuana in his pocket. It was a small amount for a misdemeanor.
Okay.
And they found a gun, not on him, but in that alley, a cartridge on the other side of it.
Okay. So he separated the two, tried to hide them.
Well, the gun had a cartridge in it, and they found another cartridge on the other side.
Okay. And that cartridge was fitting of the gun that was left on the other side?
Yes.
Okay.
So basically, he was charged with resisting arrest for running. He was charged with the marijuana possession, and he was charged for carrying a gun without a license. Okay. And I know that's a big, long description of everything.
All misdemeanors, though.
They were all misdemeanors. Okay. And basically, we were going, the cops were testifying, because all the testimony from the state was from either a cop or somebody who used to be a cop who was, testing the evidence. And
right.
So and then the only defense witness was the guy's wife.
Okay.
And basically,
which they didn't have to even present a witness.
No,
correct?
They don't have to.
The burden of proof rests on the prosecution.
Yeah, and they had even asked questions in the jury selection, saying, if the defendant chooses not to testify, you can't hold that against him.
Right.
They tried to explain that up front. So basically, the lawyer for the defense was kind of somebody made a joke in the jury room. He was reminiscent of my cousin Vinny, because he stuttered a lot, and he wasn't the most eloquent speaker.
Did you say the Utes?
And so, as we were discussing the case, and basically, the real issue to the case was the gun. They weren't really fighting the drug possession, and even the defense attorney's closing arguments basically said, they found the marijuana in his pocket. I'm not going to insult your intelligence. Use your common sense.
Right.
Okay. So that was a fairly easy guilty verdict.
Smoke weed every day.
But all of the defense basically had to do with the car was registered. Okay? Mm-hmm. Which would be great had he stayed in the car.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but since he got out and ran, it really didn't help him that much. You know, and the reason he called the wife to testify on the husband's behalf was to say it was her car and it was registered, and they showed the registration.
Yeah.
You know, but she wasn't there when any of this happened, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so basically the way we ended up voting, you know, we found him guilty on the drug possession because there was really no fight against that. There was a little bit of discussion over resisting arrest.
Okay.
Because and basically they define it very, very easily. They tell you they have to prove basically these four things. You have to prove
the essential elements of the case.
Yes.
Yep.
It was the defendant. He knowingly ran from a law enforcement officer, and that officer either visibly or audibly identified himself. And so the way we looked at it was, we know it was him. We watched the video of from the cop car. The cop's lights were already on when he ran.
Yeah.
Okay, when he got out of the car, and it was like 12:30 at night, so you don't miss those lights.
Right.
Okay. So he knew he was running from a police officer.
Yeah.
So he's guilty in my mind.
Smoking a little bit of that Chiba too much makes you paranoid. So,
but there was a little bit of discussion over that because some people. It kind of started because somebody felt that even though all those things were proven, he kind of felt like that's not really resisting arrest. Okay. And it's like, well, at that point, you're kind of bringing in your opinion and not really what we're here to analyze.
Sure. Okay.
You know, but eventually we all found him guilty of that. Okay. Most of our discussion had to do with the gun charge.
Okay.
And basically the way it boiled down was none of the cops could testify that they saw the gun on him.
Okay.
None of them could testify that they, saw him throw the gun.
Okay.
None of them, they didn't have any fingerprints on the gun.
Okay.
So ultimately, even though we kind of felt like it couldn't be anyone else's,
right?
It was kind of their burden to prove it was his.
Yeah. This is the tree falling in the forest.
Yeah.
So nobody's around to see it.
So we all kind of felt like, yeah, probably was his, but as the defense attorney said, probably doesn't lead to guilt.
Right.
So he was convicted on 2 of the 3 charges.
The 2 of the 3 charges were possession and
resisting arrest.
Okay. Because he ran.
He ran. That is considered resisting arrest.
I would think so too.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though I guess technically he hadn't been put under arrest when he jumped out and started running.
That's not necessarily the issue. He knew it was a police officer he was running from.
Right. So, but there's not a separate charge for resisting a conversation with an officer?
I think basically...
Not that I think there should be.
I think basically, had he been trying to arrest him and he ran, that becomes a felony charge.
Oh, okay.
I think somebody had said something like that in the jury room.
But they still call it resisting arrest, even if he hadn't been said, you're under arrest.
Right.
I find that silly.
I kind of get that.
You get it?
Yeah.
But how can it be arrest if it's not arrest?
Well, basically, I think it's just a situation, if you have nothing to hide, you're not going to run. And when the cops' lights are clearly on.
But they use that same kind of thing with the NSA spying on the internet and stuff. They say, well, if you got nothing to hide, you shouldn't have anything to worry about.
I get where you're coming from. But,
it's crap.
But the questions we had before us was, was it the defendant? Did he know what he was doing? Was he running from a police officer?
Right.
And then did the police officer identify himself?
Now, was the law defined in a way that backed up the idea that running, even without an arrest decree, is still resisting arrest? Is that the way the law is written?
Yes.
Okay. So that at least you were dealing within the toolbox that they gave you.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So how were the people that you were serving with? Because mine were really entertaining, and I kind of laid that out. But you said that there was some discussion about the things that were going on, where ours was pretty black and white when it came time to deliberate. Were the people that you served on the jury with pretty sensible, or was the random mix of people, did it make it difficult?
I think it was pretty sensible. I mean, there wasn't anybody that threw out any red flags to me. It's like, well, why is this person here?
Okay.
I know you had the conspiracy theory on yours, but
yeah. conspiracy theory grandma, cop killer construction worker.
Yeah.
All of those in the article.
Yeah.
I had to question why they picked all of those people, and then it made me also question if I'm in this company, what does it say about me that they chose me?
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't have any moments like that. And then after the trial, they said we don't have to discuss it with anyone, but we're free to discuss it with anyone we want. And the prosecutors had actually kind of came out in the hall and were asking questions. They kind of just wanted to know what evidence we liked, what evidence we didn't like, what they, if there was anything they could have done better. And we all kind of, just kind of explained. It's like, even though we felt it probably was his gun, it's just when there's no prints and no witnesses and no anything, it's just it's kind of hard to.
That's reasonable doubt.
Yeah, and she said, well, would it have changed anything if you'd known he'd had this was like his third gun charge? Which they can't tell you that, before the trial, because you don't want that to factor in, to whether or not he's guilty. Because at one point we were thinking, one of the jurors in the jury room said, if there's no prints on this gun, on the cartridge, on the bullets or anything, are we dealing with like a real professional here? What kind of person are we sending away?
Yeah.
But actually one of the prosecution's witnesses had actually said they only find fingerprints on a gun about 7% of the time.
Really?
Just the way, because it's not a smooth surface. There's kind of patterns and things engraved into them, so it's just hard to get a print on them.
People probably watch enough TV too that they know to like wear gloves if they're going to be using, an illegal firearm or something like that nowadays. But in terms of reasonable doubt, you could just as easily say, well, if these things were planted near the crime scene, but there was no fingerprints on them, could they have possibly been planted by the police who were trying to bring a conviction down on this person?
And we really never discussed whether or not we thought the gun was planted. It was just...
But that would lie within the realm of reasonable doubt.
Yeah, it would be. It was more just a situation where we really felt it probably was his, but there just wasn't enough there to get the conviction. But what kind of stuck with me is, they said... The guy that they had talked to about the fingerprints was... he was a retired cop, but he was working at the lab that kind of did all these tests and stuff. And he said, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, they get a fingerprint about 7% of the time when they test the guns. Apparently, locally in South Bend, they get about 9%. So they're actually doing a little bit better. Okay. So the fact that they couldn't get a fingerprint kind of told me nobody would have got one.
Right.
But he also said it's more common that they get it from the cartridge because it's a little bit more protected, because you're going to have fingerprints as you slide it in there, but then the handle of the gun's essentially going to cover it up.
Right.
But they still didn't get anything from that.
Okay.
So I guess you just don't think that, fingerprints on a gun would be 7%. You think it'd be a little bit higher.
Yeah. A lot higher even.
Yeah.
So overall, how did you feel about your experience? Do you feel like you served your civic duty, and does it make you proud?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's it's one of those things where we kind of rip our president when he kind of ignores laws and sends these executive orders out, and so I feel like when I'm called to do something, I feel like I need to do it the right way.
Right.
So.
Well, it was interesting to me too, and you said you had maybe some libertarian questions that this could kind of venture down that road. But I just wanted to say that our judge really pressed the presumption of innocence until they proved beyond a reasonable doubt that she was guilty, and also emphasized the fact that as jurors now we were the judge. He became a moderator, we became the judge, and it really. As much as we get down on politicians and stuff for, I guess, taking the law into their own hands, and we have every right to do so. The fact that there is still on a local level this idea that a jury of your peers is going to help and be a testament to your innocence, and that they're going to maintain that innocence all the way until they can't maintain it anymore. It does give you a little bit of a feeling like, what, this is what America's supposed to be. This is the good meat and potatoes of politics without the politics. Like we're really helping each other out, and we I hate to say we the people, but like the people of these juries are a safeguard to our neighbor to make sure that they're not being put in situations. And I'm not saying that bad things don't happen within the judicial system. I'm not saying that, good people don't get put away, because I'm 100% sure that happens.
Oh, yeah.
And even the way that they define the laws on paper, and those are the way that's like the parameters with which you're supposed to make your decisions. I could see that sometimes could cause someone who is not guilty to actually get put away. However, in the 2 court cases that I've sat in, I think that I felt like it was a much better system than what we're saturated with as far as like national level politics.
Right.
Seeing that all the time. It's a much better, it leaves a much better feeling in your stomach at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, because I know when you hear, cases that people get really worked up over, like what was her, like Casey Anthony, when she, and that kind of thing. But I don't think people really understand the responsibility you feel to get it right until you have to do it. It's real easy to watch a case on the news and get worked up. Like, well, how can they vote that way? But you're not paying attention to the same degree that they're paying attention. You're not focusing on the same things. And when you just watch something on TV, that innocent until proven guilty, I don't know how much that really weighs with you, but when you're in that jury room...
Yeah, it's like a cliche.
Yeah.
You hear it all the time.
But when you're in that jury room, that is your number one obligation.
Right.
Yeah,
and I know that for me, it definitely felt like a priority.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting thing in my case where it was like this woman who was, she had these charges being brought against her, was definitely not the most clean-cut person that I could see running around in our community. And her thing was she was being charged with intimidating a police officer, saying that she was going to beat him up when he was trying to arrest her. And so he was charging her with intimidation. Well, all they had to do was prove that she made a threat. And it was one of those things similar to yours where she probably did make that threat. Like just seeing her there talking, how she presented herself and everything, she probably did.
Right.
But they couldn't prove it at the end of the day. And I wish there was a system where we could just, factually know.
Right.
One way or the other as a jury. It's like, well, this person did or did not, and that's entirely up to evidence. But I think that at the end of the day, this is the best system we got.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because the other thing we were talking about, because like your incident was actually fairly recently, wasn't it? Didn't it happen like
Christmas Eve 2014?
Okay, ours actually went back to New Year's Eve as 2013 started. So actually 2 years ago.
Wow.
And we kind of felt like they've had 2 years to work on this case, and this is all the evidence they have.
Yeah. So what was the holdup? Did they say?
Oh, they didn't explain the holdup, but we were just kind of guessing about it in the jury room. We just kind of thought, well, maybe the defense is probably just trying to buy time,
right,
to come up with money to pay his lawyer.
Oh, okay.
Because sometimes that's all it is.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting how things can linger on for so long. I mean, even in the news lately with like Pharrell Williams and Robin Thicke and their case against the Marvin Gaye family.
Right.
I mean, how long has that been going on? Blurred Lines was the summertime hit of, I want to say 2013.
I think so.
And they just reached a verdict on it this week. That's going to continue to go on because, as I understand it, Pharrell and Robin Thicke are going to make an appeal.
Right.
So, and I think they should. It's amazing to me that they, I guess, decided the way that they did in that case.
Yeah, a lot of people are scratching their heads over that one.
Yeah, because I mean, it definitely musically sounds like the same song, but like the way that the vocals are done are entirely different. So the way that I saw it was it's inspiration versus, what was the word that they were using? Inspiration versus, just like a total ripoff. And I think it was definitely Marvin Gaye inspired. And if you were to ask Robin Thicke or Justin Timberlake or Pharrell Williams probably who their main inspirations in music are, Marvin Gaye would probably be somewhere on that list.
I would think he would be pretty high up there.
Their age and who they listened to as a kid, that probably all factors in. But to say that it was just like the same song is kind of ridiculous. And somewhere they determined that it was just pretty much the same song.
Yeah, because I guess the thing I'm thinking about as you mentioned this is like, I had a conversation with my brother, a few weeks ago about Bruno Mars.
Yeah.
And he's got a lot of stuff that sounds like stuff from the 80s.
Right.
So does he have to go and pay all those people now?
Right. Yeah.
You know, because like, I've drawn a blank on the song now. He's got one. You know, to me, like when you hear like,
Uptown Funk even sounds kind of Rick James-ish.
yeah, it does.
Or something.
You know, and since you've known my brother more than 5 minutes, you know how much he loves Uptown Funk.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and then what is it? Locked Out of Heaven kind of sounds like a song by the Police
It does.
at times.
It's got that vibe.
You know,
kind
and
of reggae, classic rock kind
you know,
of thing.
and even like Grenade and Just the Way You Are. To me, you can definitely tell there's a Michael Jackson influence there.
Sure.
You know, but like I said, is he going to have to go back and pay every artist that he's ever, been inspired by?
Yeah. Oh, and hip hop music. I
Yeah.
mean, like how many rappers have sung about Cristal, bitches and hoes, fast cars, money?
Right.
I mean, they should all have to pay each other. Hip hop's going to become a very communistic type community real quick because everybody's just going to have to like divvy up their money because they all
Right.
talk about the same things.
Right.
So
Well, the other question I had is, since Weird Al did word crimes, does he have to go and pay Marvin Gaye now?
I mean, it's an interesting case. But you said that your case brought up some questions that you thought.
Well, as far as like, police overextending their power because, he started searching this guy's plate just because it was a white Crown Victoria.
One morning, I was driving to visit a client at work, and I turned left on a yellow light, and a cop pulled me over who was behind me. And he gave me a ticket that day because I had no seatbelt on. But as I understood it, he couldn't just pull me over because it appeared from where he was sitting that I didn't have a seatbelt on.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah, it was because he thought that I should have turned or stopped rather than turning at where the light was at, that he thought he'd pull me over and just tell me that. And then when he pulled me over, he realized I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And so that's why I was getting the ticket. And to me, it seemed a little funky. And so it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like I feel like they look for their in. They look for their angle. How can I justify this on paper when I write up my reports at night? But I'm still going to, have the conversations that I need to have, meet whatever quotas they're telling me to meet, et cetera. And that sounds to me like the seatbelt incident.
Yeah, I would say so. And, it was one of those situations where, and basically the police officer just said he just saw the white Crown Victoria pass in front of him, so he started running the plates to see whose car it was. And it's like, well, it just bothered me so much. And then he followed the guy. He said basically a mile and a half until he pulled into a parking lot and stopped him there. So he didn't actually even pull him over.
Let me ask you this. In my case, white cop, black defendant.
Same thing in mine.
All the cops that testified?
Yes.
And like with everything that's gone on recently, whether it be Ferguson, whether it be Trayvon Martin, any of the stuff that's been in the national media, for me, I feel like it made me hypersensitive to racial bigotry and different things going on in law enforcement, abuse of power. All that stuff was swirling around somewhere in the back of my head. And I don't want to say that it created some sort of mental static for me, but I think it made me hypersensitive to making sure that the ruling that I was putting out as a juror was going to be the most accurate ruling that I could come up with. Because I didn't want to contribute to that national narrative. And even though it seemed like there was room for that with the characters in my case. Did that ever cross your mind?
No, I wasn't really thinking about like Ferguson or anything like that. But, I did obviously notice right away that it was a white cop and a black defendant. And there was really no good reason for him to even really be.
Yeah.
So I almost kind of wondered, if, because they didn't tell us ahead of time that the guy had prior convictions. So I almost wondered if maybe he had prior convictions and the cop recognized him from a previous incident or something.
Right.
And was just saying that, well, I was just curious who the car belonged to. But he also did say he stops people all the time for, basically like registration issues and stuff like that. And it's like, well, unless you can't see the plate, how do you know you have a right to even search for that? I mean, it really bugged me.
Well, I wish we had more time to kind of bat this stuff back and forth, but we've already gone over the normal amount of time that we allot for the show. Let's go ahead and tip the cap to somebody and try to bring this off on a light note. And then next time, and we'll encourage people. We'll say, go read at WeAreLibertarians.com. Go read the Jury Duty Experience, parts 1, 2, and 3, or read the entire complete collection that I stuffed into one article. And it's like 11 pages on a Microsoft Word document, which I thought was insane. I'm glad I wrote it in fragments.
Yeah.
And listen to this and think about Jason's case and think about what would your opinions be if you were in Jason's position as he was sitting in the jury box. And give us your feedback on the CAP's Facebook page, via Twitter, at CAP Podcast. And just let us know, if you have any kind of alternative angles that you would have looked at, or any additional questions that you would have asked, or answers that you would have wanted based on the information you were given in the parameters of this podcast. We would be really interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, I know once we found out we were both going in for jury duty the same day, it's like, well, this is we have to discuss this on the show. And,
yeah, absolutely.
And then just as the details of my case unfolded, I'm just like, man, this is interesting stuff.
Yeah, and it was just so coincidental that we both ended up there.
Yeah.
Even just walking up the steps of the courthouse and seeing you in front of me, and I was like, whoa, this is so weird.
Well, one other quick thing I want to throw out there, they tell you, not to do your own research, don't go to the crime scene and stuff like that.
Right.
Well, as we went to lunch, most of us just went to Subway. We walked right past that alley that he ran down. We could see the fence he jumped. It's not like anybody got out and tried to jump the fence themselves to see how tough that would be. But,
yeah.
We just happened to walk right by the crime scene. But.
Yeah, you look about the same weight and size as the defendant, so let's see if you can make that jump.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. All right, so with all that said, Jury Duty Edition, Cap 25, we are a quarter of the way to 100.
Yes.
Which is cool. And do you realize we've been doing this for over a year now?
Yeah, we have.
That's really cool to think about also.
It is.
So who are you going to tip the cap to today?
I'm going to tip the cap to Tom Hanks. I just saw this story before I came in.
Yeah.
He was approached by a young girl selling Girl Scout cookies.
Okay.
They'd been struggling to sell them. And so he bought 4 or 5 boxes. And so people on the street start saying, hey, that's Tom Hanks. Can I get a picture? He said, you can get a picture, but you have to buy some Girl Scout cookies. So he essentially, spent some time. Yeah, he helped these girls sell some Girl Scout cookies. And I thought that was a really cool thing.
It's almost like charity work.
Yeah.
That Tom Hanks is such a funny guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not like a comedian. He doesn't... he's not funny in the way that you usually think of Hollywood funny, but he's funny because he puts himself out there.
Mm-hmm.
See the new Carly Rae Jepsen video?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Most simple pop song I think I've ever heard.
Okay.
He says really 6 times in the chorus. The first line of the chorus is, I really, 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 really like you. That's the chorus. And Tom Hanks plays kind of like Justin Timberlake has done for Elton John in the past, or Christopher Walken with Fatboy Slim. Mm-hmm. He is like the centerpiece of the video. For most of the video, they don't even show the singer. They just show Tom Hanks lip-syncing this teenage pop star's lyrics, which is really funny to see Tom Hanks, I really, 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 really like you, as he's going through his routine, and he's singing this entire song. It is very funny. So yeah, I like to applaud Tom Hanks. He's a funny dude. So tip of the cap to Tom Hanks. Man, I had one in my mind, and now I'm drawing a blank. Maybe we should both tip the cap to Tom Hanks. So now I'm drawing a blank. Have you seen the TV show Empire?
I've seen a few minutes here and there.
Pretty awesome drama.
It's not bad.
I was just watching that before I left the house, and since I've lost mine, seemingly, I'm not sure where it went. I'm going to go ahead and tip the cap to the cast and creators of that show.
Okay.
Yeah, good show. Check it out. And as always, for episode 25 of the Culture and Arts Podcast, we tip the cap to you, and we will see you next time.
Do you want me to? Who gave you could keep them. I don't know how to act or if I should be leaving.